Hello, this is video 2 in Developmental Psychology concerning science and research. The first thing I want to talk about is the hypothesis and the variables. Remember I said a hypothesis is a statement that relates two or more variables, and so it's a prediction about how those variables are connected, your anticipation of what relationship that those variables will have with each other. Now, there's two kinds of variables. You may recall some of this from classes in which you discussed what science was and how it operated. One is the dependent variable. Some people call it dependent. I call it dependent variable. A variable that is caused or influenced by another. And then the independent variable is a variable that is controlled or systematically manipulated by the researcher. So the dependent variable is what happens when you manipulate the independent variable. Okay? All right. Now, a theory is a broadly stated group of tested and experimented and shown to be true parts that are organized in a way that explains something very big about the natural world. So it's a well-tested explanation of some aspect of the natural world. It conforms to observation and experimentation. So theories are not the kind of theory that we use in everyday parlance. So when someone says, I got a theory about him, I think he's a little bit off. No, that's not a theory. That's your assumption. We use the word theory incorrectly all the time, and people sometimes really don't understand what a theory is in science. Theory is the highest level of organization, of understanding about some phenomenon or phenomena in the natural world. It's a very high order thing, and it's constantly being tested and assaulted to see if it's not true. One of these is the theory of gravity. Until recently, we knew what gravity was, basically. We knew how it operated. But now we have even better explanations for its origin. It now seems that gravity is the result of space-time warpage as opposed to simply mass. Well, a higher mass distorts space-time more than a smaller mass, so we have more information than we did. But the theory of gravity is the theory of evolution is another some people say, well, it's just a theory. Well, yeah, it is a theory, and every single time we look at it and try and find fault with it, it works. Okay? We've never found, for just one example in the fossil record, we've never found a human fossil in very old rock. No. Every time you look at any aspect from any angle, from any science, evolution holds up. Now, are we filling in areas of sequences that we didn't have before in terms of the development of the right fin in this animal over this particular 100-million-year-old period? Yeah, we're filling that in, absolutely. But it's not a destruction in any way, shape, or form of the theory of evolution. Okay, it's so much of a theory, as is the theory of gravity, that we now call it a fact. When something is so consistently supported by experimentation and observation, and the degree to which it explains things that we encounter, we eventually get to call it a fact. Evolution is a fact. Theory, gravity is a fact. Okay. Now, a very effective theory, and those are two examples of effective theories, have a number of characteristics. One of which is that it explains existing phenomena. It explains what you're seeing. It tells you how that happens. It tells you what the mechanisms are for that happening, whatever it is. It is widely applicable, so you can use it wherever you are in the world. It doesn't matter. Today, tomorrow, and a week from today or a year from now, it's still going to hold up. Here in Burundi and North Vietnam and anywhere else. It is very predictive. It predicts extremely well about what will happen under certain conditions concerning that phenomenon. Okay? So it's a good predictor. And again, the last thing is it stands up beautifully to repeated testing and attempts to disprove it. That's an effective theory. Okay? Now, let's talk about scientific observation. So when we're looking around the world trying to develop a question that we don't know the answer to, we have to be very objective and clear about what we're looking at. We want more than one person to look at it. We don't want it to be a one-off observation. Okay? We want it to be very objective and very clear. By the way, this is not what happens when people report having been abducted by aliens into spacecraft. You're always getting somebody out in the middle of nowhere that nobody else sees and nobody else can attest to, and it's a singular story, and I could go on and on about this, but that's an example not of something that's objective and clear. Has to be systematic, measurable, have to have some kind of measuring that is tangible, and repeatable. We can't just have a one-off. It has to be repeatable, see? All right. Now, there are a number of different research methods in science. One is the naturalistic observation. This is generally done in social sciences, wherein you are trying to be unobtrusive. You don't want people to see that you're watching them or measuring them, because then behavior changes. You know, if you're being watched, your behavior changes. So we're watching things that occur in the natural world, in the field, as it were. Next best thing would be in a house that people would temporarily live in with cameras everywhere, or a playroom in a lab that's made to look like a playroom where kids would play, and you're observing the children, that they can't see you through a mirror that blocks their vision from their direction. And so we want more than one observer. This is called inter-observer, and what we want is for each of those observers to see roughly the same thing. That would be high level of inter-observer reliability. Now, naturalistic observation is prone to errors because there's so many variables. You're looking at live behavior. That's why we have more than one rating. And of course, you're going into this with a clipboard about, what things are you looking for, and you're ticking off what you're seeing and things you're not seeing later, and then to be a report written, and you'd compare and contrast the various relators. Maybe there are 3 or more people who are observing. So that one's not purely scientific. It has a lot of possibilities for error, but sometimes that's all you've got. Okay? Then we have what's called case study. Case study occurs when you've got a very few number, maybe even one, but a very few number nonetheless, of a very unusual circumstance. So you don't have large numbers that you can do surveys, you can do true experiments with. And so this may be the only way to conduct data. So you do it at interview, you'd videotape it, you'd audio tape it, you'd have questions you put together in advance, and it's very time consuming as a result. And of course, it's prone to errors. People can not remember things, or they may embellish with or without conscious effort. And so there are problems with case study. But again, sometimes it's all you've got. Then we've got interviews, and then we'll talk about true surveys and true experiments. Interviews are when you record responses of large numbers of people when you ask them questions face to face. You're interviewing them. They are structured. You're asking the same questions in the same way of everyone. That means that you have to have objective and well-trained interviewers, but you're going to here again see some problems. You're going to get self-presentation bias. I like to call it self-preservation bias. That's not an official phrase, but I like to use it. Sometimes people will embellish to make themselves look, or sometimes make themselves look bad. People's memories can be faulty again. So you get that error. Then you also might get investigator bias. You might get an investigator that loses the objectivity. See, because the mind of anyone is malleable. So you can be responding to someone at an unconscious level, and it may change the way you offer inflections within a question that can change the direction of the interpretation the person has who hears it. Pretty tricky, huh? And then surveys, are again with large numbers of people, but this is basically a paper and pencil or computer generated survey where people respond to statements or questions with some kind of an objective scale, generally speaking. Large numbers again, but you're measuring things like attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs, and you're using the standardized form, generally computer, but it could be paper and pencil. You want the questions to be absolutely clear and unambiguous. There can't be multiple interpretations of a question. So the words have to be very carefully chosen, and they have to be related to what you're trying to investigate, right? So it does require valid, reliable. Valid meaning you're asking what needs to be asked about, what you're interested in. It has to be reliable, that if you ask the same set of questions, everyone's going to see the question as the same question, you see. And if you tested the same person over and over again, not the right word, you surveyed the same person over and over again, you'd get the same kind of response. And so it has to have non-biased construction, non-biased in terms of whatever population you're working with. If you're working with multiple populations, it has to be non-biased across those populations. And the last kind is the most scientific of all, and that's true experimental science, truly experiment. That's the independent variable that you manipulate in the experiment, the dependent variable that you measure as change, those variables. You have a treatment or experimental group, the one that gets the drug, you don't know if it works, or the treatment, you don't know if it works. And you get the control group, whether you get no treatment or the standard treatment or the standard drug. Okay? Now you have to control as many variables as you can. The slightest alteration in variables, the slightest variability that you don't detect can ruin an experiment. In those LIGO experiments, one more time, that I was talking about early on, they had to first conceptualize what kinds of interference would be recorded by the laser detectors, because the slightest interference would be misinterpreted as potentially a gravitational wave. So things like earthquakes, things like different forms of radiation, vibration caused by all sorts of different sources, heat, cooling, also just you have to anticipate those things with any scientific experiment. Yeah. And then you have to have random sampling, which means whatever, if you're working with people, I'm talking about now, you have to have the number of people, the people who are going to be in experiment have to be chosen at random, and whatever the computer chooses randomly for you, you don't choose, the computer does, based on whatever, social security number or student ID or whatever it might be. You have to stratify that sample such that it represents the entire population that you drew from randomly, in terms of age and sex and other factors. That's to be truly random. Okay? So, the last thing is to tell you a little bit about developmental psychology research formats. One is the cross-sectional, and that is looking at the performance of people of different age groups, also known as cohorts. They compare them. It's not very expensive. It's a one-shot deal. Longitudinal research is you're taking a group of people, a cohort, roughly same age or exactly same age, and follow them over time. It's expensive, time-consuming, but you get to see changes in the individuals across time. And the last one is the cohort sequential. Combines the first two, cross-section and longitudinal. Very expensive, but you get to see groups of people as they change individually over time. It's very powerful, but very time-consuming and expensive. And that's research in developmental psychology. See ya.